Tonight, the power of words in politics, in the workplace and in big business. We're bringing together a panel of writers, opinion makers and performers, so anything could happen. Welcome to Q&A. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Virginia Trioli. Tonight we're bringing you a special collaboration with the Melbourne Writers' Festival, which is now underway and can be streamed online. The theme this year is a question we're all wondering. Tell me how it ends. Joining me on the panel to figure that out, writer and filmmaker John Safran, lawyer and former Liberal and Independent MP Julia Banks. Joining us via Skype, Barrister Rachel Doyle, and she'll join us in a moment. ABC News presenter and former AFL player Tony Armstrong, and actor, writer and director Virginia Gay, who's going to close the show this evening with a special performance from her recent production Cyrano, which was cancelled just hours before opening night. It's great to have you all here. Thank you for coming. Rachel will be joining us a little later as well, and also a little later we'll be joined live by rock star Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis. He has a close connection with Australia. His daughter's doing her HSC here, and he has some bold ideas about our future. Remember, you can stream us live on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag, so please join the debate from home. Our first question comes from Jed Sweeney.
Did the Prime Minister set the wrong example by applying for the exemption that allowed him to fly home to his family for Father's Day at the taxpayer's expense?
All right, let's go to the big question of the day, Virginia Gay.
You've told me very specifically that I'm not allowed to use any big swear words.
Neither of you are allowed to swear. You're all sweary and no one's allowed to swear.
But if any story was going to get those big bad words out of me, it is this nonsense. Honestly, the idea that there is one rule for us and one rule for him, I cannot stand it. And in my industry particularly, we move about a lot. We have short-term contracts. I've got a lot of friends who are stranded on one side of a border. They can't get home. They can't get back into the state where they are residents. They are paying 2 rents and their shows have been cancelled. And this guy thinks that he doesn't have to play by those rules. And I am furious about it.
We'll clarify that there were rules in place and he played by the rules that allowed him to travel. I think it's a fair point to make. He applied for the permit and got it. Tony?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think on that, really strong leadership can be not necessarily doing what you can do, but setting a really good moral standpoint and doing the right thing, given there are so many people around Australia wanting to go home and visit their mum, their dad, their kids, their cousins, all of those kind of things. I think he had a great opportunity to set a great example, and I think if he had his time again, he might have done it differently. Julia Banks?
I'm going to exercise the same restraint as Virginia. I have to say there are rules and there are entitlements, and I notice Scott Morrison came out yesterday saying that, you know, he it was by the rules and this is a cheap shot that everyone's in. He just wanted to see his kids. Well, there's rules and entitlement and then there's judgment. And it was absolutely, totally, utterly appalling judgment to not only go and break effectively the restrictions that every other Australian, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, is under. When you've got and to say, well, I need to see my wife and children, and you know, forgive me, and let's not talk about it because it's about my family. When there are Australians who can't see their who couldn't see their father on Father's Day, who might be dying, or you know, they haven't seen them forever, and yet he gets on the VIP jet, which costs, apparently, I'm told, the cost of the trip was, you know, up to $30,000. He would need security, he would need detail, he would need staff, he would, and to go to his taxpayer-funded Kirribilli house, which is, you know, not to the home that is provided for the Prime Minister in Canberra, for the Prime Minister and his family. When, you know, so there's rules and there's judgment.
Well, intriguingly, the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, declined to criticise him. It was interesting to see Nikki Savva's column in the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald today. Yeah. She wrote that, that the Prime Minister, if you like, contacted him and secured his support, the agreement that, you know, we don't go low, we don't attack each other's families.
I read that, and again, this is this duopoly of power that is happening with our major parties. It's not going low to say that, you know, you shouldn't have spent all that money and, you know, thought one rule for everyone else, that I'm special, I'm the Prime Minister. You know, in my many, many years of crisis and risk management, the one rule for a CEO, if their organisation is under crisis, is to show up and to be there and to experience what everyone, the employee group, be that the employee group for which they're responsible, or their teams, to be there with them. But, you know, I think someone dubbed this Hawaii 2.0. You know, Scott Morrison was not there during the bushfire crisis, and he was not there, basically, where he should have been.
Rachel Doyle is with us now via Skype. Great to have you, Rachel. The question was about whether the Prime Minister showed a wrong example by applying for the exemption and getting it to go and see his children on Father's Day. Your view?
Look, I suppose I'm on this show wearing three hats, as a lawyer, a writer and a person. As a lawyer, I'd have to do a lot of tedious research in order to offer any considered view about whether any particular rule or exception was capable of operating the way the Prime Minister says. So I'm not going to take on a brief like that out of hours. As a writer...
and we're not paying. So.
No, it's not a pro bono brief I'm going to take on tonight. As a writer... A tale of there being two standards, one rule for many and another for an individual, is probably a story that's too dull, almost too predictable for me to want to write about. And as a person, I doubt that anyone's particularly interested in my contribution to the debate. But in particular, as a person living in Melbourne who's endured now over 200 days of lockdown, it's probably the case that my personal view is something that's not fit for broadcast.
And we've had a number of those so far. John Safran, are you adding to that?
No, our Prime Minister is going to have to try a lot harder to excite me about breaking lockdown, because I live in Balaclava, Melbourne, and around the corner from me 2 nights ago, there's this synagogue called Adas, and they're the ones with like the biggest and furriest of hats and the longest of side locks. And congregants,
they're very specific, very, very small, ultra-Orthodox Jewish group. And,
and they locked themselves in the synagogue, and there was all these police cars everywhere. So, like, we're all down there kind of watching it all. And there were, like, police cars, like, parked in laneways, and there was the sidelock kids screaming at the police. And then I look up, and above, like, this shopping strip where the synagogue is, I just see like this little like skull-capped little head kind of like running, and they're up on the rooftop kind of surveying down, seeing where the police were and seeing where they could break out. So
are you saying that's a bust out of lockdown? You're saying not what the Prime
that's what I'm
Minister
saying. It's like it's hard to get me excited that like he just like crossed the border to visit his family.
Okay, no, we probably can't top that. Our next question now comes from Vartsi Vlasna.
Julia Banks states she refuses to name the male minister who sexually harassed her because, quote, "I'm not fearless. I'm like most women who report these incidents for which there are consequences." Isn't that attitude locking women into the cone of silence while perpetrators go scot-free? Thank you.
That's to you, Julia Banks.
Well, it's a very good question, and it's a question I've been asked many times. And my answer is, I repeat, that I'm totally not fearless. And I am like millions of women. The fact is that the cone of silence exists in our workplace cultures and desperately exists in Parliament House because women are fearful. Women are fearful of the consequences of naming names, of going public, of providing these details. And those fears are very real. For some women, it can be affecting their financial or social well-being or their emotional well-being. In my case, I don't have the stomach to deal with what could potentially be defamation proceedings. And that is what... those are the consequences that women have to endure. I mean, we have seen this year with the cascade of events coming out of Parliament House in relation to members of Parliament, and we've seen a lot of names, but we haven't seen any consequences in relation to those names. We've seen empathy training, we've seen promotions to Leader of the House, we've seen all sorts of things, but we haven't seen any consequences in relation to those names, like investigations or a demotion or a stand down. We've
Just
seen
to jump
all
in there,
those
Julia,
things. Yeah.
do you know, without again naming
Yeah.
or identifying that person,
Yeah.
have you managed to establish whether there's been any internal consequence for that person, conversation with that person, any moment that's proved difficult for that person as a result of what you've said?
Well, my situation, Virginia, is, far worse things have happened to me in the workplace, and I've said this before. I thought about, I could well and easily have deleted that. That story. I knew that if I put that story in, that there would be speculation as to who it is and all the rest of it.
This is just for those who may not know, it's the story where you're waiting for a vote in the Prime Minister's suite,
Yeah.
and a minister came up and sat next to you, ran his hand up your thigh
Yeah.
very high,
Yeah.
and then walked off and looked back to see how you were going to respond to you.
Yeah, and fundamentally, my concern about that incident was not so much for myself, but it was and the reason it wasn't so much for myself, it was because there was a very limited power disparity between me and the Cabinet Minister. I mean, here I am, a 50-something corporate lawyer, member of Parliament, all of those things, and I kept thinking over and over, if he was capable of doing that to me, imagine what would happen to, younger staffers or indeed, press gallery journalists, all the rest of it.
Okay, let me turn to Rachel Doyle on that. Rachel, your view, I mean, the question is a good one because it goes, I guess, to those very brave women who have spoken out. And if people like Brittany Higgins and others, if what they've done is to mean something or make sense, don't we have to honour and reflect their bravery by doing the same?
I think we do. There are a number of issues here. There is a culture of silence, and the statistics have remained stubborn for decades now. Between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 women are harassed at work, and only a fifth of those will report it. I think there are a number of reasons why. One is often power disparity, but as Julia has said, sometimes people harass across, they harass horizontally. One of the real difficulties, I think, is that we have, out of a desire, I think, initially to afford privacy and to a degree agency to victims, we've started to confuse that with a culture of silence that actually protects perpetrators. So I'll just give an example that comes from the law. There's been a drive towards settlements of all types of litigation, including litigation about harassment. It's regarded as efficient and as relieving everybody, including the victim, from stress and cost. But I've become troubled over a number of years that what's really happened is we've muddled, as I say, privacy and agency for the victim with protection and silence for the perpetrators, which means, for example, that a wrongdoer in a workplace can be rolled over. Someone within the public sector can be moved around from department to department. They can stay where they are and seemingly suffer no consequences, as Julia has said, because it's settled privately, out of court, secretly. And that then ties the hands of the victim as well. There is also this perverse incentive to settle quickly the most egregious examples of harassment. So we now see big corporates, law firms, banks, universities settling some of the worst examples of sexual harassment perpetrated in their institution or on their premises. And often the victim moves on, yes, sometimes with some money, but without her career or her career path. And often the perpetrator stays, or at least is able to leave and move on to another equally lucrative position.
Yeah.
So this culture of silence is promoting recidivism and is also allowing things to happen in the same places over and over again.
Is it expecting too... hang on, Julia. Is it expecting too much, Virginia Gay, though, for the victim to always be the one who has to make the brave move, step up, name the name and go through exactly what Rachel's describing?
It's exactly that, isn't it? That the victim, the actual people who have had the terrible thing enacted upon them then have to be the brave people. That's rough. That's so rough. And it asks so much of somebody who has already had so much taken from them, agency, power, and has had their fearlessness reinforced somehow, and their lack of power reinforced. I have seen incredible change in my industry, I have to say, through women being dragged through the courts, and I have seen my industry step up and try to protect the next generation, and I have seen change, and I think that's an incredible thing to actually see.
The practices they're putting in place are practical, they're useful, they're working?
Absolutely. And these incredible women have been honoured by companies and continue to work, and I think also there's something incredibly beautiful, and I'm proud of my industry there, that these women continue to get work and continue to blossom and to triumph. But you can't ask it of everybody. It's a huge thing to ask, and to be trawled through the courts is a massive, massive thing.
Tony, did you want to jump in here with anything?
Oh, I just want to reinforce what everyone's saying in terms of how hard it would be to stand up after you've lost all of your agency. Well, sorry, not all of your agency, but you feel like you might have lost all of your agency. I can only speak from what I hear and the way I hear people talk about it. But I think there's a really important role for men to play here. We talk about it from a race point of view, in that we, especially from an Indigenous point of view, we need non-Indigenous people to step up and start being part of the change. Men need to start being a huge part of this change. If you see your mates acting in a poor manner, that's when you've got to call them out from a young age, teach them really good behaviours, because if you're not hearing what women are saying, you're not listening. And then now we need to be the ones, not to completely pick up the baton and do everything, but we can play such a massive role, because it's men who are the ones, I guess, perpetrating these really, really sick acts.
I just want to quickly go back to Rachel Doyle before we go to our next question. And it struck me when you were speaking, Rachel, it reminded me of an observation made to me by a lawyer who's specialised in sexual harassment and bullying claims for years now. That is his practice. And guess what? It's a booming practice. And he just made a blood-chilling observation to me, which was HR is not your friend. So when you have built into the organisation that you work for, and in Parliament it's a totally different situation where there is no HR, or then maybe that's about to change. When HR is not your friend, then you're going to be non-disclosed out of the organisation. You're going to, as you say, Rachel, get paid out of the organisation. You're going to be managed out of the organisation. It can blow up for the man and woman equally as well. How do we fix that problem?
It's a very, very insightful observation, because the difficulty is, if HR you could describe as not your friend, at the very least they're deeply conflicted. They need to protect the corporate image. They need to, and I do accept this, afford procedural fairness to the person accused, but they ought to also be acutely aware of the difficulties faced by the complainant and the responsibility they have for her, and it is overwhelmingly her, mental and physical safety, and also her career path and her economic future. So at the very least, HR is deeply conflicted. That has been acknowledged, I think, at least in this sense. Many workplaces and institutions now gravitate towards appointing independent investigators to look at these complaints when they're first made. I do accept that overwhelmingly that path has been followed in good faith, but I think now it's become distorted. Those internal investigations are now often so long, laborious, gruelling for everybody concerned, that the court cases they were supposed to avoid, they're now just really an imitation of or a repeat of. And many people who go through that internal investigation become despairing about the length of time it takes, and suffer greatly by dint of the fact that many people now lawyer up for those investigations. So you're having a little de facto trial in any event. So what started as a good idea, I think has become a real difficulty, and is often now just a dry run for the court case. And then, ironically, a lot of cross-examination at court is about teasing out subtle differences between the account given in the internal investigation and that given in court. Great fodder for a cross-examiner like me or one of my colleagues, but a very arid, empty way to get to the bottom of the problem, which is how do we support the complainant and how do we fairly ascertain whether the accused person has perpetrated harassment.
Let's go to our next question, and it comes from Brendan Hitchens.
Good evening, panel. My question to you tonight is, it seems like the lines between PR and journalism are becoming increasingly blurred, particularly when it comes to political reporting. How do we make sure that we're holding these media outlets to account for their journalistic standards and the words that they share?
Let's start with you, John Safran, because in a sense we can talk about the breathtakingly dark arts of PR that you've uncovered in your book. Tell us a little bit about that.
My book, I looked into Philip Morris, who were claiming that they're the Marlboro people, and they were claiming that they were shutting down as a cigarette company, and they were going to relaunch as a health enterprise, and they were going to try to get the 1 billion smokers, including their own customers, off cigarettes. And so at first I thought, maybe this is like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of apartheid or something, and it's actually going to happen. And then I snooped around a bit, and you wouldn't believe it. You can't take the makers of Marlboro cigarettes on face value. And what they were doing is they were... the reason they were doing this is because in Europe, the European Parliament banned menthol cigarettes all across Europe last year. So you can't make them, you can't sell them, and it was going to be the first step of banning all cigarettes across Europe. So Philip Morris, it was the beginning of the end. And so they came up with this strategy of, we're going to introduce this new product, and it's not a cigarette, it's a heat stick. And then I've actually got it. I think I got it.
Ah, you've got it. It's got a funny name. It's called an IQOS or something.
How do I not have this?
Is it at the back?
That was the one thing I had to bring. Anyway, it's... You shove
the cigarette into this stick and it heats up the tobacco.
But you look at this thing that they're saying isn't a cigarette, is a heat stick, and it's tobacco rolled in paper with a filter at one end that you plant between your lips, inhaling nicotine and tobacco into your lungs.
That's a cigarette.
And it's and you say, well, why is that not a cigarette? And they say, oh, because it's a heat stick.
And because it doesn't burn.
Yeah, they've got their own little things around the edges that claim it's not a cigarette, and but it worked. So over Europe now, you cannot buy menthol cigarettes, but you can buy menthol tobacco rolled in paper with a filter at one end that you plant between your lips, inhaling tobacco and nicotine into your lungs. And it just worked. I couldn't believe it. So it just goes to show how you've got to be on your toes. But, and I guess if you're talking about reporting, no one reported on this because it seems like a really un-zeitgeist issue, the whole thing about cigarettes. It seems like a 1970s issue, and it's like, John, if you're going to report on it, you should grow sideburns and wear flares or whatever, because what an out-of-date issue. And so that's why I think lots of the media didn't cover it. But if you've got cells growing in your body, taking over, giving you cancer, it's very zeitgeist for that, very zeitgeist for the health system. And still in 2021, 52 million people die of everything all over the world. 8 million of those are cigarette related. So it couldn't be more zeitgeist, but journalists dropped the ball, except for... just because it didn't seem like it's kind of a cool, topical kind of thing. It seemed like a dated thing.
Let me go to you, Tony, because this question really is perfect for the incredibly media-managed world of sport as well, where politeness or playing the game is access. And crossing that line means, the end of access, and access is everything in that particular world. How do you respond to the question?
Oh, it's an interesting one. I think sport... Well, actually, I've got an interesting take on this, especially around Indigenous players. Clearly, being a former one, not a former Indigenous person, still can confirm, former player. Even some of the words that are used around describing Indigenous players. So, a player will be magical, freakish. It's unbelievable the way that Eddie Betts kicked that goal. It's uncanny. It's like what we're actually doing there, very, very subtly, is we're discounting the 10,000 hours of mastery. We're very subtly getting into the general discourse that Eddie Betts, through no training, could just picked up a ball and magically can kick a goal from anywhere. No, we're discounting that. And then when you talk about the way a lot of, I guess, non-Indigenous players are reported on, it's hardworking, tough, reliable, courageous. So even words like that it can very quickly change the way a conversation goes. And then when you talk about access, it's quite funny. We beg for players to be themselves, and then the second they are themselves, we're like, oh no, showing too much personality. He's just got to, 1 week at a time. It's all that kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting world, the sports reporting world. Yeah.
Where do you see the dark world of PR, Virginia, intruding into the kind of reporting you want to see?
Well, I think that the extraordinary thing about words generally is, of course, that it's our main form of communication, but it's also our primary means of obfuscation. Like they can work for good and evil, right? And
they do both very well.
They really do. And if you have somebody who's in a position of power who is not a good person but is great with words, then you're in the beginning of a nightmarish hellscape. Like, that's the beginning of a dystopian future. But I think there is also an extraordinary capacity for words, particularly at this moment when we're so isolated, for words to carry extraordinary messages of hope, for words to actually make us feel incredibly connected when we can't be literally connected. So I'm not throwing words out, Virginia. I think that's my final take on that.
Yeah,
I'm pro-words.
I think that's a fairly good take.
Yeah, pro-words if carefully used. Yeah.
All right, our next question now comes from Tom Ingleton.
My question is for Tony Armstrong. After Taylor Walker was banned from the AFL for his racist remark to Robbie Young, I noticed an article written by a non-Indigenous journalist stating that casting him aside from the game would set back the league's fight against racial vilification. I would love to hear your opinion on what you believe is the right outcome for Walker, and if it's frustrating when non-Indigenous voices are deciding what is an appropriate response for a person who's used a racial slur.
Tony.
That's a great question. Yeah, look, I think I've spoken about Tex before, so I won't actually speak about him itself. I think one of the big issues we've got here is that Indigenous players make up, I would say, 10.5%, 11% of the AFL and the AFLW. But then when you start going up into positions of structural power, so we start talking about coaching, we start talking about people on the boards, we start talking about people in their AFL house, that number very, very quickly diminishes. So when it comes to people making those decisions, well, we simply don't have people in the tent. And it's very, very important that we do get people in the tent who are then making those decisions. So Tanya Hosh is doing an amazing job at the AFL, but at the moment it's really, really hard for her because at the AFL executive level, she's by herself. We haven't had an Indigenous head coach across all the clubs ever, which is a complete blight on the game. We talk about, making these decisions and having non-Indigenous people making those decisions. It's simply because we don't have Indigenous people in the tent making them, which is really, really frustrating. And it's not like there's not the cattle out there. It's not like there aren't people who are clever enough, articulate enough, smart enough, brave enough to be there making those decisions. It's just, I don't think we've put the time into fostering that talent and giving people a leg up. You've got to give people a chance. It's the same in the media. Like, we talk about words and we talk about the media, the way so many of these things are reported on. Like, the reason why my phone always rings is because I'm like the only one, basically. It's like someone else, like give a number of the people who are clearly good enough a chance.
You and Brooke Boney during NAIDOC week, your phones just must ring off the hook.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe it. I actually exist for 51 other weeks. Did you know that?
Don't go telling us that.
No, sorry, guys.
I'm almost reluctant to come to you with I know it was a question for you and that's great, it was a good question, but I'm almost reluctant to do that because it must get so exhausting sitting there going, oh, here comes the Indigenous controversy. Here comes the question again. I'm going to have to stand up for the whole damn lot. Yeah, well, it's good. I powered New South Wales with my phone last night week. It was unbelievable. Yeah, but like that. But I guess the flip side to that is Brooke Boney, myself, Narelda Jacobs, whoever else is in the media. We've got a responsibility because if we don't do it, then it's white people talking about these issues.
which is
Julia, I just want to quickly come to you because I know you spoke about discrimination in your maiden speech to Parliament. It's a different experience, of course, to that Tony describes, but you've got a connection to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm of migrant Greek heritage, and indeed I experienced it from a very young age when, my mum's Australian born and we had a very Aussie upbringing, so to speak, but by virtue of my family name and my looks, I remember a young boy in the playground saying, well, go back home, go where you came from. And I was just absolutely staggered as a child because I just thought, well, this is my home. Like, I don't know any other home.
You had to go home and look up the word, I think.
Yeah, I went home to look up the word and it said a person from a foreign land, and it just did not make sense to my childhood mind. And I think it's basically that if anything makes you feel conspicuous, and unfortunately, to pick up on Tony's point about the power positions where decisions are made, unless and until we get diverse audiences, diversity on these leadership decision-making bodies, not just in our parliament but everywhere, our culture will continue to. Yeah.
The parallel here is critical mass that you need, whether it be women in Parliament or critical mass of Indigenous voices, and that's the only way that you ever get change. We'll go to our next question now, and it comes from Gemma Ryan.
I'm a Year 11 student and aspire to work in the entertainment industries, either film or theatre. The pandemic has forced many people to shift their dream careers to a side project because it isn't providing them with the financial stability they need. Throughout the past year, I've been told by many people that a career in the entertainment industry is simply an unattainable dream. So, do you think we'll see the arts industries return to their pre-coronavirus states and make a full recovery? Or has the pandemic changed the face of these industries forever? And is wanting a career in the arts still something today's young Australians can realistically strive for? Or should it simply remain a hobby?
Virginia, is it going to be just a hobby for Gemma?
No, Gemma, it's not just a hobby. I believe in you very strongly, Gemma. No. Okay, so listen. This is a really bad time for the live performing arts industry. This is a really, really problematic time. And I have been enormously grateful for things like Netflix, for HBO, for getting us through lockdown. But there's a relationship that you have with a screen, which is not the same relationship that you have when you are in an audience watching people do the thing right in front of you, when you're surrounded by strangers, when you enter into this pact where you say, okay, you show us something. And I think the most extraordinary thing about live performance, and I think the reason that it will come back, Gemma, and the reason that you're going to have a great career. Gemma, I can't wait to work with you. It's going to be glorious. We'll make a show. It'll be wonderful. We'll tour it. But the reason that I think live performance will come back, and has to come back, is because that thing, that sense of community that live performance makes, is the very thing that we have been missing so hard for the last 2 years. And it's magic, that stuff. It's absolutely magic, because there's this thing that happens when you see a theatre show, when something happens on stage and you go, oh, I know that feeling. And you feel 500 people around you go, oh, I know that feeling. And it makes you feel not alone. And in this time when we're so alone, this particular style of performance will come back so hard and so strong because we're making up for lost time.
John, I'd love to hear from you on this as well, particularly in terms of the creative work that you've done during lockdown. But before we do, I think it's important that we point out that your directed production of Cyrano, which was written in lockdown, which was rehearsed in lockdown, which was just about to open at the MTC in Melbourne and was scotched by lockdown on opening night. And you've sat around in Melbourne trying to keep the rehearsals up online all that time to keep it going, has now closed here in Melbourne. Will it be put on anywhere else?
Listen, we're hoping, we're looking. There's an enormous desire for this show, particularly because Cyrano is about somebody who has isolated themselves to protect the person they're in love with. And this particular thing is, as I was writing it, I was like, oh, we're all going through this exact thing. Incredible. And of course, what was really important for me in writing it was that if you've got a queer female Cyrano, it had to have a happy ending. And I also, as I was writing it in the middle of lockdown in LA, when Melbourne was going through its longest, hardest lockdown, I was like, we deserve a happy ending. I cannot have any more tragedy. I cannot have it. And nobody's got an appetite for it. So yes, we are looking, we are hoping, we're crossing fingers. If anybody wants to throw us a grant, I'm over here.
The grants can be sent to me and I'll send them to Virginia.
Thanks.
John, the creative process for you?
Yeah. On a surface level, lockdown just screwed with my book. Luckily, I'd gone out in the world and gathered a lot of nuts and I had enough that I could write when lockdown started, thank God. But I was planning to go to Switzerland, where Philip Morris headquarters are, and the worst thing that happened is I went to lunch in Melbourne with a Philip Morris executive, and he offered me a junket to go to.
Nice.
Yeah. And I said yes, and so then, and I was also, after I said yes, I go, oh my God. Is he secretly taping me, right? And I started getting paranoid because I hadn't seen his phone on the table the whole time. And then I was going, okay, it doesn't matter. But then when lockdown happened, and then it was like, oh, listen, you can't go to Switzerland anymore, I just thought it's the worst of both worlds because I'm not going to get the junket. But I accepted the junket. So, I've got all the downside of being...
You're condemned without the upside.
I know, I'm the downside of being compromised, but none of the benefits of being compromised. But then, luckily, because you're a writer and you have to be kind of lateral or whatever, I did get to make the book fun, and I'm in lockdown. I talked all about that, and I think I get away with it but you get away with that trick one book. There's no way my next book can start off with, anyway, I'm still in my apartment here. Did I tell you about my fridge last time?
I hear from publishers, they are just knocking back any books about lockdown. No one wants to publish them. No one wants to read them. Rachel Doyle, I know this question would trigger in you something that you appreciate deeply, which is the performed arts and what you've missed all this time.
Yes, look, like Virginia, I'm grateful that screens have allowed us to find some workarounds. It's the reason why I've continued to be able to work at least part of the time during our long lockdown. Most courts went online, but I regard that only as a second best workaround. There is real theatre in the courtroom. I've been remarking to friends, I feel like I've lost all of my value add. A lot of what I can do comes from being able to create a rather toxic atmosphere in the courtroom, on the huffy silence, the rolled eyes, the very vicious page turn.
I'm appreciating the candour here, it's great.
I'm taking notes.
I've lost all of that. And I also love the arts, and I want to get back to see live performances for all the reasons that Virginia said. And I am sad that there hasn't been as much innovation or, let's be frank, money thrown at the arts as there has been at other industries and sport. I wish we could have seen a support given to and a recognition of the fact that actors also need to continue to practice and ply their craft, as do ballerinas, opera singers, and all other performers. And I wish there'd been a more innovative use of the bubble for the arts industry and all those who work in it in all those ways. And things like streamed performances, heavily subsidised, of course, with very small audiences live, but with a long run, so that you could have maybe only 10 people watching it each night, but streamed to many more who are then grateful for the opportunity and willing to pay for it. Yes, it would have had to have been heavily subsidised, but it would have been a way of keeping people engaged. And those of us who watched it would have enjoyed it greatly as well. And so I applaud the viewer who asked such a great question, and I hope Gemma does find her way into the arts, and I'm sure she will.
I can see Gemma and Virginia on stage anytime soon, I'm sure. Now, I'd like to bring in Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis, who has a long-standing connection with Australia and has been involved in Sydney's Antidote Festival, which can be streamed online as well. Yanis, thank you for joining us from Athens. It's great to see you there. Our next question is for you, and it comes from Bohan Stantajic.
This is a question for Yanis Varoufakis. How would you rate Australia's economic response to the COVID-19 crisis? And if you were in charge, would you have done things differently?
Yanis, over to you.
All the boring questions come to me because I have this predicament of being an economist and a Greek economist. I shall compare the the response during the COVID-19 period to what happened after 2009 under the Kevin Rudd government, after the GFC. Both responses were large. The 2009 response was more effective in the sense that money went directly to families independently of their circumstances. So it was a more efficient system. The support of the Australian economy now, during the pandemic, has been larger, and it had to be larger because the shock was greater. But I very much fear that it has created a large wall of money, which, as the pandemic recedes, and we hope it will soon, so that I can come and visit my daughter to begin with, that this wall of money is not going to fuel house prices yet again, asset prices, because this is the great scourge of the Australian political economy, housing. If all this money becomes higher asset prices, it will be a monumental waste of all this liquidity that has been created by the Reserve Bank of Australia, instead of going into investing so that we have good green jobs for experts, for the arts, for that matter, which is not a luxury to be added on to whatever else Australians are doing. So, to cut a long story short, take this liquidity and put it to good use. Do not waste it on real estate.
Yanis, I'll come back to you. Julia Banks, I'm just wondering your response to that question.
Yeah, my response to that question is certainly the Australian government showed itself with the 2020 budget in relation to basically a budget that was blind through the gender lens. Women were severely impacted, particularly impacted. Unemployment level, more women were unemployed as a result of the COVID. And they, for example, in terms of childcare, they got it right first, but then, of course, the childcare workers, amongst the lowest paid workers in the country, were the first to lose JobKeeper, whereas the money was ploughed towards, the trades and the sort of male professions. And this threat of sexism still continued with the October budget, where $500 billion, but to women, they were raving that this was the budget for women in terms of COVID, but 0.03, I think it was 0.038% went to women. It equates to, and it was over a long period of time till 2025. So it works out. I'm not great with numbers, but it works out to apparently $8 a year for women. Homelessness, funding for victims of domestic violence, and we know that COVID and lockdowns has seen a dramatic increase in domestic violence, and we also know that one of the biggest issues for women who are victims of domestic violence is that they need somewhere safe to go. And the funding was cut to provide affordable housing or funding for these women. So I think, it's really impacted.
Let me just go back to Yanis, because I know something that you've noted and that concerns you is that Australia's falling behind, not only because the model that we've relied on for quite some time, which is our heavy reliance on China, you regard that as outmoded, that is finished, and we need to somehow look elsewhere. What's the solution to that, Yanis?
Investment. It's not just Australia, by the way. I'm not being critical of Australia. It is also the European Union. The two blocks that are suffering, if you want, if you consider Australia a small block and the European Union, is the European Union and Australia. Because the business models that both Europe and Australia have relied upon for prosperity are now debunked. And it's the United States and China that are steaming ahead, coming out of the crisis stronger. This, of course, is clouded over by the emerging Cold War between them. And Australia and the European Union are running a very serious risk of being left behind, because the technologies of the future are green energy, artificial intelligence, robotics, And this is where there's insufficient investment, both in Australia and the European Union. And at the same time, we have to remember that, if Sierra Leone or, some developing country that is simply impoverished are not investing, well, you can understand that. They don't have the money to invest. But both Australia and the European Union, we're swimming in money. We never had so much money as we have today. But we're wasting it. We're not investing it into the things that we need. And I totally concur with the point that I just heard about the manner in which women's rising discontent has been completely ignored by the government. But in the end, imagine we were exploring the universe, Star Trek, and we chanced upon some alien civilization. We would look at where they are putting their resources in order to judge their collective character. Where are we putting our resources today? In the large corporations that already are sitting on a huge stash of money, into men and into the powerful.
Yeah, Yanis, we're going to fix your line because you're terribly out of sync, so we'll sort that out. But let's go to our next question, and it comes from Adrian Guy.
I used vaping during my first COVID shutdown in March 2020 to finally give up cigarettes after 43 years of trying and failing by every other method. I don't vape huge amounts of smoke. My lungs feel better, I feel healthier, and my smoking cough is gone. After a lot of search online, I found that there are just 10 telehealth doctors registered to give prescriptions to over 600,000 current vapers. So my question is, why am I going to be forced to become either a criminal or go back to cigarettes because the bureaucratic system's created a monster that doesn't have the logistical capacity in place to scale when we hit ground zero?
John, we'll go to you on that one.
Oh, man, so many things he brings up. Well, first of all, he's going to get away with it, because the government can ban vapes from overseas, but it's like saying, oh, we're going to ban lipstick. It's like, yeah, well, what actually are you going to do? Like, how are you going to stop it? And that's
someone will find a way to bring it in.
Well, someone who I spoke to a guy who runs the biggest vape empire in Australasia today before coming on, and that's what he said to me. He said when this October 1st happens, where everyone's going, oh my God, vaping's going to be banned, he's saying, what are they going to do? It really is like saying you're going to ban lipstick, and it's like, how can you follow through on that? And I guess when it comes to it being whether vaping is a health device or a health danger, that's where it gets like really confusing. So because the thing that kills you in a cigarette is that it contains tobacco. Tobacco generates tar. That's the tar kills you. Whilst in a vape, there's no tobacco leaf, so it doesn't generate tar. So therefore, vaping people can say the most dangerous thing in a cigarette isn't in a vape. But then it becomes, well, you're still inhaling other things like propylene glycerol and nicotine and flavourings, and then it becomes, well, will there be other really bad health consequences because of that? So that's where it becomes really tricky in deciding.
We were talking about language and the uses and trickery of language before. Is that another example where the language and the words and the description used has been equally as obfuscating, where it's actually been very clever in what it's hidden and what it's tried to promote with vaping?
Yeah, and particularly Philip Morris, because what we were talking about before, which isn't a vape, it's a heat stick, it's a cigarette. But the way you heat it up is you stick it into this device, and that plugs into a wall. So Philip Morris can say it's an e-cigarette, even though it's totally different to a vape, because a vape you also plug into a wall, and you can say it's an e-cigarette. So sometimes, for instance, the British National Health Service, they came out in favour of vaping, and they said, oh, we think e-cigarettes can help you get off cigarettes. And Philip Morris would go, look, all this good news about e-cigarettes. Except the National Health Service made it really clear that when they were talking about e-cigarettes, they were talking about vaping. They weren't talking about this cigarette that you plug in a wall from Philip Morris.
Yanis is back with us. Yanis, if you missed the question, it was a question about vaping. A man who's actually used vaping, he says, to successfully stop smoking, and he'd like to be able to continue doing it. I know you've got a particularly personal struggle with vaping. Not yourself, of course.
Don't let my daughter hear you.
Too late, she's watching.
I'm not so sure. She usually avoids shows in which I feature. Look, if vaping was something that was started by some small cooperative in association with the Australian Medical Association or some body of experts, I would be interested to hear what they have to offer the world. But when the tobacco industry is behind that, it's clear what's going on. What we have is a situation where, once Philip Morris hit a wall of resistance from our democracies, then they moved on to the labyrinth of deception. They are finding other ways of doing damage to people's health in order to profit from it. Until vaping becomes a small business, health industry associated enterprise, I'm really not going to look at them as anything other than a threat to young people and older people, for that matter.
Have you managed to dissuade your daughter from vaping? Is she listening to her father, Yanis?
How do I know? How do I know? How does any parent know? In theory, yes.
Just quickly from Rachel Doyle, if anything you'd like to add there from a legal perspective?
Oh, look, I think in John's book, he makes the point very well that Philip Morris have been very clever here in shape-shifting. Their devices are heat sticks when they shouldn't be cigarettes. They're an e-cigarette when that's what they need to be. They're a vapor when they need to be that. And it's the ingenuity that they've shown in working around the law. And when I was reading that part of John's book, I was reminded, of course, of another occasion on which tobacco companies have helped us learn new terminology. British American Tobacco, of course, are famous because of some litigation in Victoria decades ago that concerned their document retention policy, which was a euphemism, of course, for a decision made over a number of years to destroy documents that had been warehoused between rounds of litigation. So it's not the first time that a tobacco company has helped invent new language. And in one sense, it's inevitable. When laws are very finely written, someone will always want to work around them. On the other hand, it's enormously frustrating when the subject matter here pertains to people's health. And what you want is clarity, and you want the substance to be adhered to rather than people escaping by dint of inventing new words.
It's very quickly, John.
If you want to know how brilliant Philip Morris are with words, is because tar is the thing that kills you in a cigarette, this new heat stick doesn't contain tar. Mm-hmm. And that's because they've changed the word to tar to nicotine-free dry particulate matter. And just think of how brilliant that
Works
is.
for me, John.
And how audacious that is, that a cigarette is the most infamous nicotine product in the world. And they've come up with a new word for tar that contains the expression nicotine-free, so they've isolated the bit of the cigarette that doesn't contain nicotine and said, oh, that bit's nicotine-free. And now they can talk about the heat stick and throw in the term nicotine-free.
That's wonderful. I don't know what Orwell would make of any of this. Let's go to our final question of the night, and it comes from Leslie Gillings.
The underbelly of our nation's federal structure has been ingloriously exposed by the COVID pandemic. Our country has been fractured into 8 states and territories, each one imposing harsh regulations, restrictions, curfews and limits on civil liberties. The glaring disharmony between state premiers and leading health figures has plunged our nation into a cross between Game of Thrones and Colditz. Their taste for fear to justify authoritarian measures has seen no bounds. So, my question is, does Australia exist anymore? And if so, what will it look like post-COVID?
It's a really good question. Yanis, we'll start with you. We'll go around the panel on this for our final question. Yanis, go ahead.
Well, I'm happy to report that Australia is alive and kicking and it still exists. The fact that you have a system, federal government, the federal constitution, which was always in a state of discontent with itself from the beginning of federation to this day. And that was put under enormous pressure by a pandemic that we have not experienced in many, many decades is not surprising. But the great questions that need to be answered have to do with civil liberties, on the one hand, common goods, public goods, and the manner in which we can combine, on the one hand, democracy, and on the other hand, the opinion of experts percolating towards the demos, so that the demos can make responsible decisions within the democratic process.
Virginia, let's go to you.
Okay, so I think the phrase that I really heard there was the fear-mongering between the states. And I just wanted to say, actually, what we have seen over these past 2 years have been extraordinary acts of community. We have seen people in isolation putting their own pain and discomfort to a side and living with that daily to protect other people. And that is not fear, that is actually a form of love. That is an incredible expression of love. What I think is interesting about the move that we're making now with Delta, the fact that we can't control with lockdowns what we used to be able to control with lockdowns, is that Gladys's, her roadmap out, which just came out today, there's a lot of stuff in there, and we are looking at the incredible vaccination rate now that that's available. And I just think what we're seeing is that the carrot and the stick is working simultaneously, and I think that's quite exciting.
Tony?
I'm pretty glib and cynical about this. Walter Scheidel argues in The Great Leveller that pandemics are among the 4 great horsemen that throughout history have led to greater equality, the others being war, state failure and revolution. I think what we're seeing here is a huge class divide, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think we'll come out the other side of this with the rich a hell of a lot richer, the powerful a hell of a lot more powerful, and those who aren't in that basket in a far worse state.
Rachel Doyle.
I might take a different tack and say, pick up on the part of the question that asked, where does it end? I hope it ends with at least 2 things. A very heartfelt thank you in particular to children, teenagers and young adults who I think have had to sacrifice the most. I might say in down moments that I've lost 2 years of my life, but I've been able to continue to ply my trade, stay in contact with people through screens and effectively survive. 2 years out of my life isn't much, but when you're 4, 14, 24 or 32, the disruption to your education, to your sport, other extracurricular pursuits, music, drama, but most particularly the very special, fragile, unique social and romantic lives of young people have been interrupted and possibly fractured. So I hope it ends with a thank you to the children, teenagers and young adults who've had to endure that. And secondly, with a massive investment in mental health coming out of this pandemic, because there is no doubt that many have suffered, but most particularly the young, who may find it very difficult to get back on track in terms of education, friendships, social connection.
Thanks, Rachel. Rachel, I'll have to leave it there. I'm sorry, Rachel, just because we are pressed for time, which means Julia and John, I'll have to ask you to be brief.
Okay, so look, I'm going to be brief and talk about vaccinations, and that is, I think, any crisis is difficult, and you've got to act quickly, and you'll always make mistakes. I think our state premiers overall have done a good job for Australia, and I think where we failed has been in the vaccination rollout, absolutely, and totally devastatingly. And that is because we should have relied on our state jurisdictions. They have been immunising our children for over 100 years, and that is how our federation has worked. And because of the PR nature that the federal government wanted to achieve, they wanted to say that they've saved Australia and vaccinated
Julie, I'll get you to wrap up.
They stuffed that up. So basically,
people were already in their bubbles online when we could still go out into the streets, but so this is just making it worse. Everyone in their little silo and not having their opinions and their beliefs that can sometimes get really dangerous, not having them challenged. When I wrote a book about extremists, I saw one of the great things that helped end extremism is like people had to finally get off their little online thing and like go into the world, and then they see that people in the world think they're odious and they're like, Oh, geez. And I don't want to be like that. So I do worry that people aren't getting enough fresh air.
So we just basically all need to get back into the world, and we all know that. That's all we have time for this evening. Please thank Yanis Varoufakis in Athens, and thanks to our panel as well, John Safran, Julia Banks, Rachel Doyle, Tony Armstrong and Virginia Gay. And Ms Gay, that's your cue to set up. Thank you very much. Thank you for all your questions. Next week, Stan Grant joins you from Sydney, exploring what life with vaccine passports will look like. On the panel, Labor's Linda Burney, lawyer and diversity champion Mariam Vazize, and foreign affairs expert John Lee. Tonight was meant to be the closing night of Cyrano, a play that was written, rehearsed and cancelled in lockdown. Here's the wonderful Virginia Gay with a monologue that no one has yet had the chance to see.
I want to take you to every restaurant in the city, every single one. And we'll say to the waiters, just bring us what you think the best food is. No, don't tell us, just bring it to us. I want to take you to a museum in Amsterdam. I want to kiss your neck amongst the Rembrandts, the marble that looks like flesh. How did they do that? Butterflies in stone with transparent wings. Let's go to a cabin in the woods together. Can it be a log cabin? It has to be a log cabin, right? Let's get very rich and own a log cabin. Let's own several and give them away to friends. And also, let's never get rich. Let's always work and know the worth of our work. Let's get our hands dirty and sleep well at night. Hey, do you snore? I mean, I guess we'll find out. Let's have a garden. Yeah. Let's have a garden with a big old table out the back, and we'll throw a sheet over it and we'll serve up lamb we cooked for hours, except you're a vegetarian, you told me that. We'll serve up eggplant we cooked for hours. And then we'll invite everybody over and they'll drink wine and laugh, and none of them will leave. And at 3 a.m. we'll reluctantly call some of them cabs, and the rest of them will wedge about the house, a sofa here, window seat there, little corner of the kids' room, sweep the Lego out of the way with a foot, roll them in, covered in coats because we've run out of blankets. Kids, I did say kids just then, didn't I? Look, maybe we could talk about this later. It's just I'm on national television at the moment, but yeah, kids. Okay. Let's go and see bad comedy in a back room in the East Village. Let's get lost in a Turkish spice market and come out with our skin dry rubbed with clove and cinnamon. Let's drink 50-cent mimosas in Cuba on days so hot we can't sit down. The seats will scald the back of our legs. And then let's get headaches from the day drinking and have to go to bed in the afternoon and listen to the world pootling on outside our window. Car horns, shouts of people, a hammer drill, smell of someone pressing waffle cones, gasoline, jasmine. The mess and the fuss of living.